I appreciate your time this afternoon. I've read and reviewed so many of your books. I have this feeling like we've already met.
Thank you.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is actually about the books themselves, because, I don't just review your books, of course. I review a number. But you stand out as being someone who has not only written a great number of very weighty, in-depth books around topics in purchasing and procurement, but then you revise them and update them frequently. So I was wondering how the writing process for you aligns with the rest of your thinking and the rest of the work that you do, because the sheer volume of your writing is incredible.
Well, thank you very much. It is. It's no small challenge, but the interesting thing is, as a practitioner who works in this space, I get the opportunity to work with a lot of brand name companies around the world, and I also get to see what people are doing, what's working, what's changing, what's new, and the challenges that these organizations face. So all of those things kind of find their way into the books, and it's a constant writing process. It's something I set out to do 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in fact, when I wrote the original category management book. But I always wanted to then write supplier relationship management and then write negotiation, because for me those three things go together. When I started, I didn't think I would be able to do it, but it's one of these things that I just kept writing and kept adding to it, and gradually it kind of formed. And the lovely thing now is I'm at the place where I've got this body of work, and it's about making sure it continues to be relevant. And one of the most notable examples is the fact that we've just come out of the biggest recession since the Great Depression, and that has changed the landscape. And so one of the things that's new in the latest version of category management is that repositioning in response to the changing landscape, because the world has changed and the way procurement works at a strategic level has changed.
And I know that you've added things specifically in this third edition around category management for smaller or medium-sized businesses, as well as maybe a little bit of a closer look at what kind of a role that might play in the public sector versus the private. So those were the things that you ended up adding. Was there anything that came out?
Not really. I remember having a conversation with the publisher, and they asked me for the third edition, and I said, look, I can do that, but I've only really got stuff to put in rather than stuff to come out. There's a few of the tools have been updated. There's a few that I found new ways to accomplish some of those things. So supply and value and network chain analysis is one of those. But mostly it's about building on the existing body of work and adding to that to make it more comprehensive, more relevant, and to connect it with other groups who are now using category management.
And so what that really means for people in a practicing standpoint, and I think it's important that you pointed out, you're not coming to these books from an academic standpoint. You are in the field working hands-on with these companies. What that really translates to for consultants and practitioners is that although we are evolving as a field and moving forward, there aren't things that are becoming obsolete or outdated, and we can strike them from our tool set or our perspective, but rather we are just continually building and adding, but that foundation has effectively stayed the same.
Yes, it has. And I'm not a fan of the trend of consultants taking models and making it their own and reinventing things, because I don't think that helps the community learn. The models that we use in the procurement community, some of them are more than 30, 40 years old, in fact. So I did a conference in Stockholm recently. One of the questions that I was asked by the audience is, do you think some of these models are out of date? Do you think the Kraljic model is out of date, for example? And I said, well, no, it's probably one of the most robust models that we have. It's perfect. It works. It's not going to change, but the way in which we apply it in the context might change. And that's where the wisdom is. It's in the way we apply these tools to an ever-changing landscape that's happening and changing around us.
It certainly raises the bar, though, for people moving into the field, because you can't just come in and sort of learn what the leading or trending practice is today. Whether you pick it up in college or at a university and then build it, or whether, in fact, you're learning these processes and disciplines in the field, there's quite a bit of material that someone needs to internalize and really understand before they can then, in turn, jump in and contribute to the work being done.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, because what it shows is that procurement is really a strategic function, and it's not a simple function. It's one of the few functions in the organization that needs to touch every single part of the organization, but also has an outward focus as well. The closest internal function to that is HR, but every other function tends to be quite siloed. But procurement is different, so it needs to be able to connect with the organization. It needs to be able to connect with the supply base. It also then needs to inform and be informed by organizational strategy and connect with what end customers need and want. So that makes it a pretty important challenge. So this isn't something that you can learn quickly, but it is a skill that is becoming a robust, strategic, important skill. And I think that's also evidenced by looking at how education in this field is changing. So the traditional institutions are perhaps lagging behind slightly because they're still quite tactical, but the leading edge wisdom from universities around the world, practitioners around the world, is about procurement as a strategic function. And what does that mean? How do you do that? What are the toolkits you need? And how do you embed that in the organization?
Now, when you talk about procurement, and obviously I'm completely biased, I'm going to agree, procurement is a strategic function. I can't help but notice from a terminology standpoint that in your books you use the word purchasing in the titles versus procurement. Mm-hmm. Is that a deliberate choice, or is that just sort of how it has worked out over time?
It is a deliberate choice, and it's one that I agonized over because in my travels around the world and my work with companies, I have seen every single connotation of a label used for what it is we do. So in the US, I've seen purchasing used to mean the thing that is strategic and procurement more tactical. I've seen the reverse of that in Europe, with procurement becoming more strategic, purchasing becoming more tactical. And I've seen organizations say, well, we're a bit confused by that, so we'll call it sourcing. The reality is there's no single one word that best describes it, and there is still this battle between the words as to what it is. Is it purchasing? Is it procurement? I don't know. I went with one, and I've stuck with that, and it seems to be the one people most understand.
Okay. And certainly the changing role and function of technology in this whole process has not really helped to clarify things, because you used to have a purchasing team and they purchased, so things were simple. And then as you brought in things like e-procurement, now procurement and purchasing are things that are often done in a distributed fashion by people spread out in the organization, whereas you have a centralized procurement, I guess capital P, team that is mostly responsible for sourcing and maybe contract management or supplier relationship management, but they're still called procurement, even though procurement, the act, is carried out elsewhere.
That's right. I think we're seeing the start of a change in the role of procurement. So as e-tools are coming in, those tools are still islands in many respects. So you have e-procurement that helps with transactions. You have e-sourcing, that's another toolkit in the buyer's armory. And increasingly some other tools which are helping with things like market data and market analytics. But these are still independent systems. No one's kind of joined the dots together. And the future is probably about new technology being able to offer generic marketplaces like the Amazon that we know as consumers, but offering those into certain industries where people can just buy generic products. What that will do is it will mean procurement can become a function that is automated and easy, whereas the strategic component will then be reserved for those parts of the business that are critical. So it will enable procurement, it will make it easier, it will make it simpler. At the same time, it will change the way organizations need to structure their procurement functions.
And to that point about structure, now obviously I'm sure you've seen differences by company size, by the market that they play in. Any thoughts about both the structure of a procurement organization itself, and also about where they need to report up in the organization, or the factors that help determine where they need to report up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I think now more than ever before, there is a need for an organization to have a central procurement function. It cannot be without one. Once upon a time, if you picked up a textbook on the subject, it would offer the possibility of centralized versus decentralized. You cannot do strategic procurement with decentralized procurement. The two things don't go together. So there needs to be a centralized function that coordinates the strategic components of procurement. Now, it may decentralize the tactical bits, or it may decentralize and enable other bits, but there needs to be a centralized component. The second dimension to that is what's driving that, and the way, and that is the way in which procurement does need to report up in the organization. Procurement needs to be a strategic function, and it needs to have C-level representation. Quite simply, if the organization strategy is determining how the organization will grow, develop, and have competitive advantage, it needs to be able to do that with its end customers, but it also needs to connect that to the way in which the supply base can contribute towards satisfying the requirements, needs, and aspirations of the end customer. So if it's anything other than strategic, those dots aren't joined up in the organization and the opportunity is being missed. What we're seeing is companies are recognizing that they need innovation to help give a competitive advantage, and the biggest source of innovation is in the supply base if they can only figure out how to work with the suppliers to get at that. So that answers your second point. The third point is perhaps how the world is changing, which is that suppliers don't necessarily exist within one building in the geography in which we operate. They could be anywhere in the world, connected in real time. And that requires different approaches to be able to connect and interface with the changing supply base. So we need to have a function that's able to do that in a very different way and coordinate that on behalf of the entire business.
And to that point, one of the things we hadn't even talked about when we were looking at the whole sort of alphabet soup of purchasing versus procurement and sourcing versus contract management is then, of course, it starts to bring into play the relationship between procurement and the supply chain, which, again, are sometimes joined at the hip, other times in sort of completely different parts of the organization, depending on what industry the company is in and whether or not the centralized procurement function has responsibility for managing direct spend, which they would be moving through the supply chain, or whether they're looking at more indirect and administrative spend.
Well, do you know, the thing that I think is driving this is the way in which the supply chain is as much a part of procurement as procurement itself. Once upon a time it was separate. It was concerned with logistics and warehousing and stuff that has often been regarded as tactical, but actually supply chain is getting quite strategic too, especially if the business is in a retail or customer facing a high volume moving goods type scenario. So you reach a point where actually you can't just look at procurement, you have to look at the supply chain as well in many industry sectors. Secondarily, the way that corporate social responsibility is now an imperative for many businesses, you can't afford to not look at the supply chain. So I think what we're seeing is a convergence of theory best practice around supply chain management and theory best practice around procurement. The two are coming together. They've come from very different places. Indeed, if you look at how universities are offering courses, they're still offering separate courses, and they really are very separate. But in organizations, unless those two functions are integrated, then the organization is missing a trick.
And so what we're really kind of looking at, if we can be selfish and look at this from a procurement standpoint, is in order for us to be as effective as possible, it really is about one step at a time, maybe increasing our reach into some of these other areas. In some organizations, procurement has taken on even portions of what were previously considered finance. We're moving into things like supply chain, maybe separating out the actual movement of trucks and goods from the management of things 1, 2, 3 tiers deep into the supply chain. And I wonder what you think about the active steps that procurement can either take or needs to take in order to build their influence internally so that they're positioned to say, yes, in the past, you thought about supply chain as being sort of a separate parallel function, but in reality, we need to work together. And, not only do we need to work together, but they should become part of procurement. What role does influence play in this sort of spread?
Well, I think influence is key to making it happen and being able to realize the benefits that are available here. One of the challenges that we're up against is within organizations, people still don't quite understand what procurement is or get what supply chain is. It's still the function that buys stuff. And I think one of the reasons for this is engineers, marketeers, research and development staff, operational staff who learn their trades don't do a Procurement 101 module. And unless somebody in the organization says, hey, this is what good practice looks like when you engage with the suppliers, actually don't tell the supplier your budget. It's not a good thing. Actually, if you're going to engage with the supplier, do it in this way. So nobody ever gives people in the organization the basics. And what that means is that we're starting from a place where procurement isn't understood. So the very first step is around hearts and minds. It's about winning people to the fact that actually procurement and the supply chain can make a huge contribution to the competitive advantage of the business. And this is how it works. Because my experience is once people have worked with procurement and been on that journey and seen the power of actually taking hold of an area of spend, gaining leverage, gaining control over it, and rebalancing a supplier relationship, those internal stakeholders are on board forever. But they have to go through that learning journey, and they have to come to realize that procurement isn't about lowest price, cost out necessarily. It's about driving better competitive advantage for the business. So the battle is around winning hearts and minds and educating internally.
Do you think our greatest need in that area is to provide people with an introduction, or is it to try to overcome and correct some of the either mistaken or negative perceptions that people have around procurement based on their past experiences?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. When I work with companies, I often end up talking to the board about how procurement can help. And I still get blank faces where people just think, well, this is just procurement. If this return on investment was really possible, surely we would have done it by now. So yes, there's a bit about education, but it's also about getting people involved, telling people that procurement can make their teeth whiter or make things great isn't necessarily going to win them over. They have to see it, they have to experience it, they have to understand it, and that's a slow process, and it's one that needs education, it needs active face-to-face stakeholder engagement, it needs procurement people selling and being ambassadors, being evangelical about the cause, and it needs the organization to embrace philosophies such as category management and SRM, so people are freed to work on cross-functional teams and achieve some sort of outcome. So it requires things at an individual level, it requires things at an organizational level, and it requires an awful lot of energy and hard work. And gradually you can turn that big ship around and get it sailing in a different direction.
Now, you had made the comment just now about two of the topics that you've covered in books. And so if you add in the negotiation and purchasing piece, that sort of gives you what I believe you referred to in the introduction to this third edition of Category Management and Purchasing as sort of like a trilogy, as three pieces of an idea that go together.
Yeah.
When you look at those three ideas and then the way that you have them represented in books, certainly in your mind, those ideas are connected. From the reader's perspective, Do you have any recommendations about either how people should simply approach reading the 3 books, maybe in one order, or how they should look for connections between the topics that you cover in those 3 books?
Sure, and I think the answer to that is where you're starting from. So if you're starting from a place where you don't understand strategic procurement, but you need to get something better from your suppliers, just reading the book around negotiation will help you begin to approach those deals on a kind of piece-by-piece basis and do better, get more. So that's a great place to start. If you're starting from a place where you're trying to do strategic procurement and the organization is on board, then category management is a great place to start to do the background piece, understand the market, understand the organization, the internal needs, develop a strategy and implement it, and then figure out how you negotiate the best deal. Supplier relationship management tends to be the approach once you get to a certain level of maturity and you're able to recognize that there are supplier relationships that are important to you and you're able to determine what makes them important, so you recognize you need to go and do something that will help you unlock more value from those relationships or reduce risk exposure.
Now, with the idea of that supplier relationship management, and in some cases you hear people talking about similar ideas, but maybe under the header of collaboration, do you find that people struggle with the notion that you can work in a collaborative supply environment, and yet you still need strong negotiation skills, that in fact the two are not as much at odds as people might think?
Yeah, well, the difficulty here is as buyers, we're kind of brought up to believe that suppliers are people who we have arm's length relationships with and who we need to perhaps beat with big sticks. Sometimes that is what we need to do. But the skill here is identifying the relationships where that's counterproductive, where the supplier is so important to us that actually our only choice or our best choice for a better future is to work together. And those are the scenarios where, by working together, somehow we can unlock much more between us and share that, and we can both benefit from it than if we both did our own things. The skill is identifying that and figuring out how you can put the arrangements in place to make that happen. But it does require a very different mindset, because you're then re-educating people to realize that for this supplier, we're not going to work like that. We're genuinely going to work together, and we're genuinely going to care about how well the supplier does, because if we do that, then we will do well too. And everything that we do in that relationship then needs to be based on trust and openness, commitment, consistency, and being able to create a relationship between people. Because remember, companies don't have relationships with companies, people have relationships with people in those companies. So you create relationships that can then build something much greater between the two entities.
And it's very difficult. So when you talk about that people element, one of the stories from being recently in the news that comes to mind is the rather spectacular failure of the Volkswagen-Suzuki collaboration. And, I think giving the news another 10 days, post dissolving that arrangement, of course, VW ran into issues with their diesel engines and emissions.
Sure.
And so even though Suzuki was found to be to blame, I'm sure they were breathing a sigh of relief to just sort of be out at that point. But we do tend to hear a lot of times about the failures instead of about the successes, because the successes are just humming steadily along. They're not creating court cases. They're not creating negative press. And so we see more examples in practice of the failures than we do of successes.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, they make the best headlines after all. But the interesting difference is when we talk about failures, it is the company that has failed. It is Volkswagen that has failed, or Honda or Suzuki that has failed. And actually, the successes come down to the people who make the relationships work. So what that does is it shows that collaboration is a people thing, and it requires a whole different skill set to the skill set that the buyers are traditionally used to. So you're teaching people to go and work in another company at another location, be part of another team, go and drink beer with them in the evening and socialize. You're actually teaching them to become part of another entity so you can then work together. And the companies that have been successful in this space have done this. Apple didn't invent the products that we have today without figuring out how they can work closely with a handful of suppliers around the world who had a unique kind of technology or advantage that they saw that they could capitalize on. But it's about people working with people to achieve something great by that collaboration, and that needs a different skill set.
Now, to the point about that different skill set, and I think earlier you used the term re-education, do you believe that people who have been around for a while, who have maybe come up through a less collaborative, less relationship-oriented world of purchasing, can they move on and succeed under this new paradigm? Or do you, in fact, either need fresh faces coming in that have never worked under the old system, or to bring people over from other functions that have the requisite background, but maybe didn't have formal procurement or purchasing training under the ways of the past?
Well, do you know, I think it all depends. I don't think there's one set answer to that. What I do know is when we work with organizations going through transformation, what we see is interesting because I will frequently have conversations with CPOs, perhaps as we're rolling out a piece of training, and they will say, "What did you think about the group?" And I will see a mix of responses. So in a group of, say, 20 people who are going through the process, there will be those who have seen that the organization is changing and that they have to change, and they are up for it. And then there'll be those who don't like it, and they want to resist it, and they want to question it, and they want to pick holes in it, and they want to find reasons to kind of pull it back down again. So the phrase I use is, you've got to have people on the bus. And some people want to be on the bus, and other people are on the bus, but they don't want to be there, but they can't get off it right now. And if organizations ignore that, then the risk is that the negativity can pull it down. So one of the secrets to transformation is figuring out who is on the bus, getting people who want to be on the bus, and dealing with the people that really can't make that leap, can't change. And that's not all of them, because I've seen people turn around. I've seen people who have looked at this and thought, well, I don't like this, but I recognize that I need to change, and they've changed themselves. But not everybody makes that leap. And the unfortunate thing is sometimes you have to actually take out those people in order to have an effective transformation program.
And when you talk to these CPOs, I imagine in a lot of cases you have the opportunity to find out about their own backgrounds. Are they primarily people that have themselves come up through procurement or purchasing, or are they folks with backgrounds in different disciplines that have been offered a leadership position within procurement?
I think it varies, and there are a mix. There are undoubtedly CPOs who have come up through procurement. Some of them are good because that background has given them what they need, and in other cases not so good because they perhaps lack the wider business experience and find it hard to be as strategic as they need to be. Some people come from a financial discipline, which again, if they can understand strategic procurement, is great. But I've seen a lot of CPOs who are former finance people who just don't get procurement. They get the numbers, but they don't get procurement. Do you know, some of the best CPOs that I've seen have come from an operations background because they get what the business needs from procurement to make it work. It's possible to transition into a strategic procurement role, understand the process, the methodologies, the different components, and I don't think it's so much the background that's important, but it's the ability to connect procurement strategically in the organization and drive it forward with a new modern agenda.
Now, if I can have us switch gears here for a minute. One of the other things that's interesting that I believe was new that you either focused on or added to entirely, the third edition of category management, is the difference between what needs to take place in the public sector and the private sector. So you talk about, certainly most people, I think within procurement, the majority of the procurement audience that we interact with is private sector. But the public has this very demanding cross-section of both needing to be completely visible, have total transparency for the sake of taxpayers and governance and things, but then also needing to try to invest in these relationships. What was it that caused you to add that in this third edition, and anything additional that you wanted to offer up on that topic?
Yeah, well, when here in Europe, I found myself increasingly working with a number of those public sector organizations, many of which had bought a copy of the book and had said, look, we're trying to implement category management. How does it apply to the public sector? Frequently I heard the phrase, yes, but we're different here. Because of the public sector legislation, which exists the world over in one form or another. The reality is that the differences aren't huge. Actually, yes, there's the process, there's procedures that have to be gone through to make sure that a tender bidding process is fair and transparent and people are treated equally. But actually, category management doesn't need to change that much because if you really understand what it is you're setting out to buy, and you've challenged that need by talking to your internal stakeholders and understanding what the business actually needs, and you understood the marketplace, then at the point when you go to the marketplace, then you should be as in control as you can be for that area of spend. Now, in the public sector, what we saw was a trend of people thinking that they were doing category management, but really they were running a bid process, putting a contract in place. So it wasn't category management, it was tendering and contracting under the banner of category management. And that isn't doing anything other than renewing contracts and perhaps some small incremental benefits. So the breakthrough comes in being able to work through the first stages of category management, where you get behind what's happening in the market, the internal requirements, the supplier possibilities, and you do that piece of work before you then engage in the public sector process. So the reason I put it in was to lay out the importance of that piece and how it actually translates into the public sector very, very easily. It just requires people to be blunt, to put some more effort into the sourcing to get the right benefits and returns that they're after.
Now, when you talked just a minute ago about people using the label category management, but in fact just walking through the same old tendering process, I think that's such an important thing for everybody to be aware of, because between reading books like yours, reading blog posts, attending webinars, you do see sort of this trend, and it is a little cyclical. Okay, now we're going to talk about category management, then we're going to talk about procurement transformation, and everybody talks about it. You include it in every event or every book or article title because it does, in fact, attract people. People are interested in the concept. But then you walk away from that information resource and go back to your desk, and you find yourself saying, okay, but what does that mean I'm supposed to do? Or what am I supposed to do differently?
Sure.
What's the best step that people and organizations can take to make sure they get beyond maybe the hype, if we can call it that, the hype of these trends, and actually turn them into something actionable and real that alters their approach and therefore their results?
Sure. I mean, we see this when we run training courses, because sometimes we find that the organization has bought the training course and put people on it because they think that will change the way the organization works and the way people buy. And people go away having a great 3 days on training, inspired, and then go back to the day jobs. The reality, though, is it's much more than just a training course. The organization has to change the way people work and what they do when they come to work. So people need to come to work not thinking, I'm just going to work on the tender I was doing last week, but they need to come to work knowing that actually now they're doing this new thing, this new process called category management or supplier relationship management, and there's an expectation that they're going to work through that process, and they will have to check in and have some sort of stage review, and they'll be challenged on that if they haven't really done the market research or engaged with stakeholders properly. And that comes down to governance, and it is the thing that organizations frequently miss, because if the governance isn't there, if the organization hasn't set out a way in which it will plan all these strategic projects, the way in which it will structure people to work together cross-functionally, the way it will manage and track the benefits that are being delivered, the way it will make sure it has the capability and the way it promotes those things internally. If the organization doesn't do those things, then all of the efforts to train people to move towards strategic initiatives will be isolated and run the risk of not really getting the traction that's needed. These things have to become organization-wide philosophies embraced by all.
To what extent, and I will say right in advance, I almost feel guilty asking you this question because it's been discussed so many times, but to what extent do procurement's performance metrics also need to change in order to emphasize things like category management? So can we leave things like savings or spend under management in place as performance metrics and yet be successful under a program like category management?
Sure. Savings are always going to be there because it's a hard number. It's one everybody can relate to. It's one that drives the bottom line. We're never going to get away from savings. But savings on its own isn't enough. Especially when we talk about collaborative relationships, because when you get into a relationship that's building some sort of new competitive advantage through innovation, that's not about savings. And if you try and make it about savings, you kill it. That's about building brand, building competitive advantage. So actually, when we look at benefits, we have to look at the numbers because we're expected to, and in most scenarios they're relevant. But we also have to look at the commentary that goes along with it. If we do this, will this reduce our risk exposure? If we do this, will this give us greater competitive advantage in the marketplace? Will it win more business for us? Sometimes you can put numbers against those things, but actually I find, why try? What you actually need to do is win people over to being able to make a decision based on a commentary of the benefit that an initiative will deliver. The problem there is organizations are still run based on financial metrics. Indeed, the whole balanced scorecard approach that we see in organizations was based around financial measures because it is the most proven way to run an organization. As organizations get more mature, increasingly they're moving away from straight financial measures and recognizing that there are other dimensions that have greater value, but you've got to process them, you need brain power, and you need to interpret them in a way that people can understand. So, yes, metrics around savings, they're always going to be here, but if we can have some commentary to show the other benefits and win people over by selling it, then that gives us an even more powerful way of doing it.
And when you talk about the mindset or the philosophy change that needs to accompany these things, whether it's a change in perspective on metrics or whether it's a change in perspective that allows you to roll out category management, to what extent can procurement lead that change from within? So even if you do have a CPO, can the CPO be the beginning of that change and make it happen, or does it have to be from the CEO down or a joint effort between the CEO and CPO down? What kind of alignment at the very top level do you really need to roll out category management effectively?
Well, I think it's down to who can sell the best, because this is what we're doing. We're selling a concept. We're selling the idea that we're going to invest time and resource into doing something, and that's about winning people over. So if the CPO is able to hold him or herself in the boardroom and say, we need to do this, and this is why it's important, and this is how it will change our business and win people to that cause, then that's what's needed. Because that's the reality of what we're talking about here. People making a business case for a course of action, and that's about the ability to sell that concept to the people who will make that decision. So who does that doesn't really matter. It's about the ability to sell it.
And ultimately to then hopefully down the road change not only the way procurement works, but also how they are seen by the rest of the organization. One of the other sections that you added to the book, and actually I'll write in my review, and I stand by this, I had said this section of the book is worth purchasing the title in its own right, and that's the section that you put in about the future of procurement. And you know, in many cases, it's like things like category management transformation. You know, you go through this round every year of people making their predictions and looking out at the future. But I do think it's something that we need to take seriously, because things like category management, they're not a 12-month effort. They're a longer-term effort, and you have to be thinking about that future of procurement in order to either even see the value proposition associated with larger-scale, longer-term efforts.
Yeah, and I think if you look at these initiatives or procurement as something here and now only, then you'll miss the direction that they need to go in, because that direction very definitely is changing. And so the landscape around us is changing, and at the front of the book I talk about how the landscape's changing to set the scene for why category management is important, and then I finish the book by talking about and where I believe it's going. So if we look ahead, you know, there's a bunch of challenges that we're going to be faced with. Organizations are going to have to change and adapt like never before if they are to survive and grow and develop. So that means the role of procurement is going to change like never before. And I don't think that many people in procurement are really seeing the pace of change that we're going to be faced with, and how technology will change rapidly, and how our roles will change. If we're ready for that, we can begin to position procurement and indeed our own careers and roles to support that. But the risk is, of course, that we get overtaken and other people do it better, and we're left behind. So looking to the future is critical, and trying to second guess what's happening is essential for business success.
Any examples that you can give, either from client projects or just in general, small indicators of change that people should already be seeing or can be on the lookout for to sort of indicate what is still to come?
Well, I think there are a number of things happening. I think one of the indicators is how important assurance of supply is. So we've seen all sorts of events around the world that have made people realize that actually suppliers, commodities, these things aren't guaranteed, and things can change instantly overnight, and you could be left without a supply situation. So the volatility of the supply base says actually that's going to be very different. Other indicators are just the way that we are as consumers changing our buying habits, and we are buying from suppliers all over the world online. That means that our supply base is going to be very different to what it is today, and it may well be lots of small people connected with some sort of technology. The other indicators are around how technology around us changes, and that will of course drive the way in which we need to respond to that. So at some point in the next 10 years, things will connect to the internet more than human beings do, and that in itself will drive a preference. But I think perhaps one of the biggest indicators is the fact that around the world we're getting more wealthy. And of course we all still like a bargain. We expect things to be cheap. We want it better. We want it faster. We want it quicker. But we want it just for us. And the new differentiator that people will pay for is something that's unique. So for years, purchasing supply chain people, logistics people have talked about standardization. That's not going to be there in the future. It's going to be around how do you create some sort of procurement and supply chain operation that is agile and flexible enough to give people whatever they want for that individual when they want it, in a way that's unique and just for them.
And do you see, and then the majority of those trends really sound sort of business general. It's not that, certainly within procurement, we're the ones that are sort of owning some of the trade-off decisions or how the company looks at cost versus quality or the value of something like uniqueness and how you capture that. But it sounds like businesses in general and in commerce and trade are all being changed by these trends, these things that are happening. So if procurement is not the only one going through change, does it also change the way that we work with IT based on changes they're going to see, and finance based on changes they're going to see, and operations and how they're changing in response to these forces? Is there a lot of internal shift going on that procurement is just a part of?
Yeah, I think so. And if we remember that procurement's role is an enabler to the organization, but it's one that is connecting what the supply chain does or can do to the rest of the organization. So if we need to find different suppliers to do different things, procurement's role is to do that and to then be able to source that in the way that's going to bring that competitive advantage. And part of that might mean that the way in which operations connect with the supply base, the way in which we pay suppliers, or the financial arrangements between us happen, that means different arrangements with finance. So all of those things will change because the way we will source will change, and the whole organization will need to adapt. But I think that procurement's role could be to be the architects of that and lead how that happens, and bring all those moving parts together.
And I suppose in order to be in an architect-type position, the first step is probably just to acclimate and become comfortable with the amount of change and the types of change that we're seeing.
And be ready for what is going to come along as well. Yeah, and that requires some forward thinking, I believe.
So let me just ask, since we're on the topic of the future, what is next from your perspective? So we've talked about the titles and how they fit together, and certainly there are revisions, revised editions that come out. From a book standpoint, what should we be looking for next?
Well, that's a very good question. So the negotiation book will be a second edition of that will be published spring of next year, and that has some updates, just to bring it in line with some of the changes, some of the things that we've seen. I think that the piece that I want to work on more than anything is how all the different bits of modern procurement come together to enable something that achieves true transformation, true results. So I'm very interested in how organizations can actually make this happen. Now, whether that's another publication, whether it's something I will add to the existing publications, I'm not sure. But the one challenge that I feel is out there is actually making this happen now, making this stick.
So, Jonathan, I am so grateful for your time. As I said, I've read these books. I thoroughly enjoyed them, and I have such an appreciation for the process that you have to go through in writing them and revising them. I'm grateful that you managed to find time in between all of your client projects to share with the rest of us so that we can, in fact, read. I think hopefully, and it's one of the things I think is so important, because with all of this change, I don't think people allow themselves the amount of time to read and process and think that they need to in order to allow the change to affect them and then to be capable of different things. And so I do hope that even the fact that you're on sort of a regular revised edition schedule indicates to people that these are not things that you write and stick on a shelf or hold a door open with,
Sure.
that these are, in fact, living and evolving and working sources of information, just like the world around us is constantly changing and is very dynamic, and we need to be agile parts of all of it.
Definitely. And the one thing that reassures me is I get lots of emails from people all over the world saying, I've read the book, we've worked to implement this in our company in Indonesia or wherever it may be. And I know that people are getting successes, they're getting results, and it's helping to transform procurement, which, has been lagging behind many other functions for many years. But to see procurement being transformed and to see that actually this is a journey and we all have to move along that, and it continues to evolve and be dynamic, that actually makes me feel as if the contribution has helped in some way.
I bet it does, and it certainly has. There is no question. So thank you so much. I'm thrilled you were able to record this. I think the plan from here is that certainly I'll be able to write up something about our conversation, but sure. I think it's much better to give people the opportunity to hear you speak as well, and so I'm glad we were able to capture it, to add the dimension of your voice to your words that they're so accustomed to seeing on the page.
You're very welcome, and thank you indeed for your time as well.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
You're very welcome, and you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.